Welcome to a new series here on Mad Hatter's Civil War History Channel. In this series, we explore the history of the politics of war and its impact on the war itself. In our first installment, we explore the relationship between Robert E. Lee and his old warhorse, James Longstreet. It's the politics of war, Robert E. Lee versus James Longstreet. At Gettysburg, Longstreet told Lee that a direct assault would end in disaster, but Pickett's charge went forward anyway. History has come to many obscure places, has stayed a while, and its departure has rendered those places famous. In America's saga, perhaps no out-of-the-way place has taken on a greater historic importance than the southern Pennsylvania village of Gettysburg. There, during 3 summer days, July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, the nation's fate may have been decided. When the battle was over, General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia began the retreat to Virginia, defeated by Major General George G. Meade's Union Army of the Potomac. Gettysburg would forever hold a place in the minds of all Americans. Since those unforgettable 3 days of battle, controversy has stalked nearly every facet of Gettysburg. In the post-war years, Southerners came to regard the battle as the great if of Confederate history. Southern independence had beckoned on the farmers' fields and wooded knolls for 3 days, then, like an alluring siren, disappeared. To Southerners, the great fault not lay with our great chieftain Lee, but with the most trusted and senior lieutenant, James Longstreet. Of all Gettysburg controversies, none has so shaped history's interpretation of the battle as has the Lee-Longstreet dispute. The controversy had its origins in the days following Lee's brilliant victory at Chancellorsville, May 1st through the 5th, 1863. In the woods and fields west of Fredericksburg, Virginia, Lee's outnumbered army defeated the Federals of Major General Joseph Hooker. The victory achieved by Lee's audacious tactics and Lieutenant General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson's assault on the evening of May 2nd. Lee defied the odds, divided his army, and drove Hooker's troops back across the Rappahannock River. It was arguably the crowning offensive stroke of the war for Lee, although its price was the mortal wounding of Jackson. In Chancellorsville wake, Lee held the strategic initiative in the east. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, commander of the Confederate First Corps, had missed the Battle of Chancellorsville while serving with 2 divisions on detached duty in a supply operation in southeastern Virginia. Longstreet rejoined Lee outside Fredericksburg on May 9th. The next day, a Sunday, the same day that Jackson would succumb to his wounds, the 2 generals began a series of private conferences that continued for 4 days. Together, they fashioned a plan that would carry the Confederate Army northward in a second invasion of the Union territory. Longstreet was 42 years old at the time, the senior subordinate officer in the Army. Since Lee had assumed command of the Confederacy's major force on June 1, 1862, Longstreet had emerged as Lee's finest lieutenant. In the aftermath of the 7 days campaign outside Richmond, Lee had privately described Longstreet as the staff in my right hand, and on the bloody field at Sharpsburg, Maryland, Lee called him my old warhorse. Promotion to senior rank above Jackson followed for Longstreet, and he and Lee developed a relationship Longstreet described as affectionate, confidential, and even tender from the first to the last. Now, with Jackson gone, Lee needed Longstreet's counsel more than ever. At the initial meeting in early May, in all likelihood, Longstreet proposed a plan he had broached to Secretary of War James Seddon in Richmond a few days earlier. As Longstreet saw it, the Confederates needed to concentrate troops in Tennessee for an offensive thrust into Kentucky that would relieve the threat posed by Union Major General Ulysses S. Grant, Longstreet's best friend in the antebellum U.S. Army, against Vicksburg, Mississippi. If the Southerners advanced into the Bluegrass State, the administration in Washington would pressure Grant to detach troops to the endangered region. Longstreet argued that 2 divisions from Lee's army should be sent to Tennessee. "I laid it before him," Longstreet later wrote, "with the freedom justified by our close personal and official relations." But Lee objected to the plan, as he had during the previous weeks in Richmond. Lee wanted to exploit the initiative earned at Chancellorsville with a strategic offensive operation across the Potomac River. Lee argued that such a movement would disrupt federal operations for the summer, garner needed supplies, and temporarily relieve Virginia of the war's burden. Longstreet agreed to Lee's operation, and on the 14th, the commanding general journeyed to the capital to persuade Jefferson Davis and the Confederate cabinet. In the time during the post-war Gettysburg Controversy, Longstreet presented versions of these meetings in published writings. He asserted that he had opposed the offensive movement, but accepted it once Lee assented to fight a defensive battle when the 2 armies collided. All that I could ask was that the policy of the campaign should be one of defensive tactics, Longstreet stated in his memoirs, that we would work so as to force the enemy to attack us in such a good position as we might find in his own country, so well adapted to that purpose, which might assure us of a grand triumph. Before his death in 1870, Lee denied that he had acquiesced to the idea of a defensive battle, terming the assertion absurd. Although Lee never promised Longstreet to fight only such an engagement, it was understood within the Army by certain officers, beside Longstreet, that the Confederates would maneuver to force their opponent to attack them unless circumstances compelled otherwise. Lee even stated in his campaign report that, if it had not been intended to fight a general battle at such a distance from our base unless attacked by the enemy. Longstreet also presented additional insight into what he termed the ruling idea of the campaign in an 1873 private letter to his former division commander, Lafayette McLaws. Longstreet wrote the letter before the controversy about his role in the battle had been reported in the press. He informed McLaws that he and Lee had talked almost every day from the 10th of May until the battle. The 2 men discussed previous Confederate victories and concluded even victories such as these were consuming us and would eventually destroy us. Lee and Longstreet concurred on what the ruling idea of the campaign must be. In Longstreet's words, under no circumstances were we to give battle, but exhaust our skill in trying to force the enemy to do so in a position of our own choosing. The First Corps was to receive the attack and fight the battle. The other corps to then fall upon and try to destroy the Union Army of the Potomac. This significant letter has the ring of truth to it because it reflects Longstreet's beliefs as a soldier and because of the events that would unfold at Gettysburg. In the spring of 1863, Longstreet thought that the Confederacy faced a crisis of manpower. If offensive assaults continued as they had at Chancellorsville, the blood of the South would be drained away before ultimate victory could be attained. Our losses were so heavy when we attacked, he asserted, that our army must soon be depleted to such extent that we should not be able to hold a force in the field sufficient to meet our adversary. To Longstreet, assaults meant the sacrifice of men. If the Confederates had to assail the enemy, it should be done when success seemed assured and that resultant victory was worth the cost. He believed that Lee's Second Manassas campaign in August of 1862 was the general's masterpiece, the ideal mix of strategic offensive and tactical defense. On the old killing ground around Bull Run, Longstreet had watched Jackson's troops defend a position until his divisions rolled forward in a counterattack that nearly destroyed the Union Army. As Longstreet headed north with the army, he expected Lee to fight as he had at Second Manassas, and not with the audacious tactics employed at Chancellorsville. On June 3, 1863, the leading elements of the rebel army began to march. During the previous fortnight, Lee had reorganized and refitted his splendid force. Jackson's death had necessitated a change in commanders, so Lee divided the Army's two corps into three, promoting Lieutenant Generals Richard S. Ewell and Ambrose P. Hill to corps commanders. Lee knew the weapon he possessed, saying before the operation commenced that his men, if properly led, would go anywhere and never fail at the work before them. A sense of invincibility permeated the Army's ranks as the Southerners marched toward Pennsylvania. Before they departed, all the rebels knew that a collision with the enemy was inevitable. It came on Wednesday, July 1st, as both armies followed the roads to Gettysburg. But Lee never expected nor wanted a battle on this day, issuing orders against bringing on a general engagement. For a week, Lee had heard nothing from his cavalry commander, Major General Jeb Stuart, about the whereabouts of George Meade's units, and the lack of any report from Stuart worried him. It was one of Longstreet's spies who carried the initial news to Lee that the Federals also had crossed the Potomac. While Lee endeavored to reconcentrate his corps, his Confederate units collided with Union troops outside Gettysburg, precipitating a battle. Longstreet was riding with Lee when the Confederate commanders heard the sounds of artillery in the direction of Gettysburg. Lee spurred ahead while Longstreet oversaw the movement of Southern units toward the village. The Confederate commander was a blinded giant, according to historian Douglas Southall Freeman, as he rode toward the ominous rumble. He arrived west of Gettysburg in time to give his consent to an assault by troops belonging to Hill and Ewell that routed two Union corps, driving the Federals through Gettysburg streets to Cemetery Hill, south of the village. Although Lee would have preferred to offer battle only after his divisions had reunited, the day's outcome brought both a victory and the tactical initiative. Longstreet joined Lee on Seminary Ridge west of Gettysburg at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. When he arrived, Lee was busy, so Longstreet examined through field glasses the Federal position to the south and east. When Lee finished, Longstreet turned to him and remarked, "We could not call the enemy to position better suited to our plans. All that we have to do is file around his left and secure good ground between him and his capital." Lee reacted with some anger to Longstreet's advice and, jabbing a fist toward Cemetery Ridge, replied, "If the enemy is there tomorrow, we must attack him." "If he is there," Longstreet shot back, "it will be because he is anxious that we should attack him. A good reason, in my judgment, for not doing so." Neither man said anything else, and as Longstreet admitted later, he was not a little surprised at his commander's reaction, his apparent impatience. Longstreet wrote McLaws about how surprised he was to find all of our previously arranged plans to be unexpectedly changed, and why I might wish and hope to get the general to consider our former arrangements. It looked like another Chancellorsville, perhaps another uphill assault as at Malvern Hill to Longstreet, and he thought it a mistake, a dismissal of their previous discussions. In Lee's defense, his subordinate's proposal made little tactical sense at the time. Lee knew only that 2 corps of Meade's army were on the field, but what of the other 5? Where was Meade's flank? Without Stuart's cavalry, Lee could only fathom a vague march beyond an unknown flank. He had not won at this day's fight, But a battle had occurred, his units had won, and the enemy was there. A battle thus became, in a measure, unavoidable, Lee stated in his report, and in view of the valuable results that would ensue from the defeat of the army of General Meade, it was thought advisable to renew the attack. Lee and Longstreet soon parted, Lee to visit Richard Ewell on the army's left, Longstreet to his camp along Chambersburg Pike. Lee's visit with Ewell resulted in little regarding the next day's plans. The commanding general was committed to be offensive, but the details of the operation would have to be completed with another morning's sun. Before dawn on July 2nd, Longstreet rejoined Lee on Seminary Ridge. The First Corps commander had not been able to hide from his staff at the previous evening's meal his disagreement with Lee's decision to renew the attack. Now, for a second time, Longstreet repeated his proposal for a broad turning movement around Meade's left flank. As he had on the afternoon of the 1st, Lee rejected it. He responded by informing Longstreet that he would need the services of the divisions headed by Major Generals Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood. Sometime between 7 and 8 o'clock, Captain Samuel R. Johnston of Lee's staff returned from a reconnaissance of the Union left flank near the Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top area. When Johnston assured Lee that he and his party had reached the base of the hill and found no Federals on the ground, Lee prepared an attack scheme that would have McLaws and Hood advance up the Emmitsburg Road toward Cemetery Ridge. Longstreet objected to the troop alignment, but Lee firmly overruled him. A short time later, Lee mounted his horse Traveler and rode to Ewell's headquarters for another conference with the Second Corps commander. Lee had not issued specific orders to Longstreet before he departed, but the latter undoubtedly understood what Lee intended and what role was intended for Longstreet's own First Corps in the assault. Undoubtedly, too, Longstreet was troubled by the plan. He failed to conceal some anger, wrote Major Moxie Sorrell, his chief of staff. To Hood, Longstreet confided, "The general is a little nervous this morning. He wishes me to attack. I do not wish to do so without picket. I never like to go into battle with one boot off." Lee returned to Seminary Ridge approximately 2 hours later, about 11 o'clock. While he had been on the Army's left, Longstreet had done virtually nothing to implement the movement except to order Colonel E. Porter Alexander to find a concealed route to the right for the artillery. He neither conducted another reconnaissance nor checked with Alexander to ascertain if he had located a route, nor conferred with McLaws and Hood. There was apparent apathy in his movements, admitted Sorrell. They lacked the fire and point of his usual bearing on the battlefield. Longstreet allowed his disagreement with Lee's plans to affect his generalship, and he deserved censure for it. While he may have opposed the idea of an offensive, he was still in a position of responsibility. What Lee expected of Longstreet during the 2-hour interim is uncertain, but Lee expected something. Without specific orders, duty required that Longstreet attend to the preparations for a movement. On that morning, Longstreet was not the same general who had performed so capably on previous battlefields. His judgment about the offensive may have been correct, but he owed more to Lee than he gave. Lee now issued the orders. Longstreet asked for a delay until one of Hood's brigades reached the field, and Lee consented. Sometime before 1 o'clock, McLaws and Hood began the march toward the southern end of the battlefield. Along the way, the two divisions had to countermarch to avoid detection from a Union signal station on Little Round Top. Instead of finding unoccupied ground once they cleared Seminary Ridge, the Confederates found the Union Third Corps stretched from Little Round Top to the Peach Orchard and northward along Emmitsburg Road. Adjustments in the attack formation were needed, and Hood argued for a movement around the Round Tops, a request Longstreet refused. Finally, after all the disagreements, delays, and realignments, the Southern assault rolled toward the enemy. The Federal lines exploded with artillery fire. Men fell at each step. With one of them writing a few days later, I could hear bones crash like glass in a hailstorm. But Longstreet's veterans kept coming, crashing into the salient at the Peach Orchard, clawing their way over Houck's Ridge into the Valley of Death, sweeping through the now famous wheat field and scaling Little Round Top. Federal reinforcements hammered them back, recoiled before the counterattacks, and fought with the tenacity that saved Meade's army. Longstreet was at the front, issuing orders, doing his duty as he had previously in the hell of Sharpsburg and in the fury of Fredericksburg. He later stated that his men rendered the best 3 hours fighting ever done by any troops on any battlefield. It had not been enough, however. Against successive waves of Federal units, the rebels had finally stalled. When other Confederate divisions did not continue the in-echelon assaults as Lee had directed, Meade's army still clung to the Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top. Lee watched the terrible struggle and concluded that if his commanders had coordinated their assaults, the Yankees could not withstand the thrusts. That night, Lee ordered a renewal of the offensive for daylight, July 3rd. Before sunrise, Lee rode to Longstreet's position, near the position known ever since as the Peach Orchard, where he expected to find preparations for the assault underway. When he did not find the men forming, Lee sought Longstreet and an explanation. "General," Longstreet said in welcome, "I've had my scouts out all night, and I find that you still have an excellent opportunity to move around to the right of Meade's army and maneuver him into attacking us." Lee clearly was angry. He had heard enough. He pointed toward Cemetery Ridge and said, "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him." As Longstreet saw the situation, Lee wanted too much. Longstreet said that a direct assault on the Federal position was doomed, that it would mean the sacrifice of my men. As Longstreet recalled later, I felt that it was my duty to express my convictions. I said, "General, I've been a soldier all my life. I have been with soldiers engaged in fights by couples, by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know, as well as anyone, what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arranged for battle can take that position." The exchange was a defining moment between the two generals, the culmination of 3 days of disagreement over the Army's tactics. From the afternoon of the 1st, Longstreet had seen Lee taking risks, willing to accept casualties while striking the enemy. Now Lee was asking even more, a frontal assault with no chance of success, with an enormous loss of life a certainty. The idea went against the basic beliefs and characteristics of Longstreet's generalship. Following a thunderous artillery bombardment, the brave Pickett rode to Longstreet for the order to advance. The senior officer was so overcome with emotion that he could not speak. He only nodded his head. When Pickett turned away, Longstreet went to Alexander's battery and there told the artillery officer, "I don't want to make this attack. I believe it will fail. I would not make it even now, but General Lee has ordered it and expects it." Longstreet then watched as the Confederate ranks marched towards the ridge and to the slaughter he had predicted. Union cannon crews and infantrymen blasted apart the Southern units in a gale of death. As the remnants of brigades stumbled back to Seminary Ridge, Longstreet saw that Pickett's division was gone. Nearby, Lee rode among the survivors, remarking to a general, "All this has been my fault. It is I that have lost this fight." Pickett's charge, as it came to be called, was a dramatic finale to a battle rich in drama. Lee's army began its retreat the next day, and within a fortnight had returned to the safety in Virginia. Before long, examination of Gettysburg began, and it will, in all likelihood, continue as long as Americans seek explanations of the past. Part of the nation's soul lay in such places as Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill, Little Round Top, the Wheat Field, the Valley of Death, Devil's Den, Trossel's Woods, and Cemetery Ridge. After Appomattox and the end of the Confederacy 2 years later, Southerners fashioned their own interpretation of the conflict, and Gettysburg became the tantalizing and bitter if of the war, and the centerpiece for the Lost Cause movement. Lee and Stonewall Jackson became enshrined as Southern heroes above Blaine and Longstreet, for too many, the scapegoat. After the war, the former First Corps commander became an apostate in his native region, a former Confederate who had joined the Republican Party and accepted federal jobs. Politics and personal animosity fed the controversy, and Longstreet became known as the man who lost the war for the South. Gettysburg became the cornerstone of his critics' case. Had he done his duty, had he not sulked, had he not stalled, Lee would have achieved victory on July 2nd. To be sure, Gettysburg was not one of Longstreet's better performances of the war. His conduct on the morning of the 2nd warrants criticism. But his failings were not isolated. The Confederate effort at Gettysburg revealed an army plagued with command problems and an extended 5-mile-long battle line. Lee's incomparable infantry could not overcome those crippling handicaps. E. Porter Alexander, who became perhaps the Confederate Army's most astute chronicler after the war, wrote that Lee never paid his soldiers a higher compliment than in what he gave them to do at Gettysburg. But Longstreet was correct in his judgment, Alexander argued, because the Union position could never have been successfully assaulted. As for Longstreet's objections to Lee's attack plan, Alexander explained in a private letter, "It is true that he obeyed reluctantly at Gettysburg on the 2nd and on the 3rd, but it must be admitted that his judgment in both matters was sound, and he owed it to Lee to be reluctant, for failure was inevitable, do it soon or do it late, either day." James Longstreet died in 1904, a man still vilified by former friends and comrades. Before his death, Longstreet told one of his opponents at Gettysburg, Union General Dan Sickles, that the battle was the sorest and saddest reflection of my life for many years. He grieved not for what might have been during those 3 July days, but what had been, the terrible price that he had foreseen. It's your history. Learn it, know it, love it. Like and follow so you don't miss any of the exciting episodes from Mad Hatter's Civil War history.